Wrong place for a funeral, lady.
My brother was mid-toast when I walked into his business dinner. 20 clients, wine glasses raised, the kind of evening that closes deals before anyone touches a contract. He saw me across the room, set his glass down, and smiled. It was the easy smile of a man who has never once misjudged a room. He looked at his clients, then at me. "Wrong place for a funeral, lady." A few of them laughed. Someone near the end of the table repeated it to the person beside him, and the woman beside that person smiled without fully knowing why. I pulled out a chair and sat down. I smiled and ordered my drink. That was Matt. Never cruel. People belonged, and very willing to say so in front of a room full of witnesses. My name is Diane Kowalski-Reed. I am 41 years old, and for 16 years I have done one thing. I help families protect what their parents spent a lifetime building. Wills, estates. The money that is supposed to outlast the people who earned it. What Matt did not say that night, in front of those 20 clients, was that he had spent 3 years convincing our father that I could not be trusted with money, moving funds through accounts our father never reviewed. Certain I did not know. He was wrong about all 3. 6 months later, I sat at my father's 70th birthday dinner. 43 people at the table, a manila folder in my lap, and I had not said a single word yet. If you have ever been dismissed by the person taking everything, stay with me. Our mother, Pat, died on a Tuesday in March of 2019. She was 67 years old. The cancer had been moving for 14 months. And at the end, she was small in a hospital bed in a way that did not match any version of her I had ever known. She had always been the kind of person who filled a room without trying. She was not loud or theatrical about it. She was simply present in a way that you felt even when she was not speaking. When she walked into a library, which she did every working day for 30 years, the room organized itself slightly around her, without anyone deciding to do that. It was the quality of her attention. She paid it fully, and she paid it quietly. And most people did not know how rare that was until she was not there anymore to pay it. In the last weeks, when the morphine made whole days go sideways, she would still reach for a pencil if she saw one nearby. That was Pat. She kept a list of everything. Phone numbers, addresses, reminders to call someone back. Things she had noticed that she did not want to forget. I have her handwriting memorized, the way you memorize handwriting you have read your whole life. Small, neat, slightly right-leaning, with capital letters that were more deliberate than the rest. Matt and I had been with her at the end. My husband Warren stayed in the waiting room because she had asked him to, gently, the week before, the way she asked for things she knew might be hard to give. She wanted it to be family at the end. Bob, our father, sat in the vinyl chair beside the bed and held her hand for 11 hours. He did not move, did not eat, did not speak except to answer the nurses when they spoke to him. He looked the way very large men sometimes look when grief finds them. Diminished, as if his body had given up whatever had been holding it at its full size. When she finally stopped breathing, he looked up at me. That was all. Looked at me. The way you look at a person when you need someone to confirm that the thing that just happened actually happened. I nodded once. He looked back at her. Matt cried. I did not. I have thought about that difference many times since. whether it means what I sometimes fear it means about me, or whether it means something simpler, which is that I was already doing the thing I do when something is too large to hold, which is to start organizing. The service was on Saturday. 92 people came. I know it was 92 because I was the one who counted the chairs. Bob stood at the door and received people for 2 hours before the service began. He was not broken the way some people break at funerals. He was present, deliberate, shaking hands and accepting embraces and saying thank you in a way that was clearly costing him something, but that he was paying anyway, because that was who he was. I stood nearby, not because he needed me to, but because I wanted to be close to him. Matt stood on the other side of the room, moving between clusters of people with ease. He had always been better at rooms than I was. That was simply true, and I had never minded it until that day, when I found myself watching him and noticing that the ease was slightly too consistent to be entirely real. I noted it. I told myself it was grief, and that grief looks different in every person. I went back to work on a Monday. I had 4 estate cases in active litigation, and a probate filing due in Franklin County by the end of the month. My clients were real people, with real families and real assets on the line, and I had told them I would be there. I was there. I drove out to Westerville twice in the 2 weeks after the service to help Bob sort through the paperwork that accumulates immediately after someone dies, the insurance forms, the Social Security notification, the bank accounts that need updating. I sat at the kitchen table with him for 4 hours, and we went through the stack methodically, the way you go through things when the person who usually handled them is the person who is gone. Bob was steady in that particular way of men who need to be doing something with their hands during grief. He passed me papers, and I sorted them, and we did not say much beyond what the papers required. The second time I drove out, I brought food, and I stayed for dinner, and we watched the early news and talked about whether the back porch railing needed replacing, which it did, and what the most sensible way to handle it was. Matt arrived about 40 minutes after I did, with a bag from the Italian place on High Street, and the easy manner of someone who has been doing this longer than you have. He kissed Pat's framed photograph in the hallway the way he did every time he came to the house, which was a thing he had done since he was about 22, and which I had never once thought to do, and which now, for reasons I could not fully name, struck me as a thing I needed to remember. I noted it. I did not say anything. That was the last time I went to Woodmere Drive uninvited for about a year. I do not know exactly when I stopped going. I did not make a decision to stop. I kept meaning to call ahead, and when I called ahead, the timing was never quite right, and gradually the calls became less frequent, and the visits became something I planned carefully and scheduled, rather than something I simply did. Work expanded into the spaces. It always does, if you let it. What I did not know, because I was there, was what was happening at my father's house on Woodmere Drive in Westerville. Later, I would piece it together from things Carol told me, from the bank statements, and from one conversation I had directly with my father that he did not fully understand he was having with me. But the short version is this: to Woodmere Drive every Sunday, 3 weeks after the funeral. Then every Wednesday, too. Then most Saturday mornings. He said he was checking in, making sure Dad was eating, making sure the gutters were cleared and the furnace filter was changed, and that Bob was not sitting alone in the dark. That was true. Matt did all of that. That part was real. He brought food sometimes, the kind of containers of soup and pasta you make in large batches, so there is always something in the refrigerator. He fixed the back gutter that had been sagging since October. He drove Bob to the pharmacy when Bob's car was in the shop for a week in April. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee with his father, and asked about the neighbors, and the garden, and the old country club friends Bob still played cards with on the third Thursday of every month. I know all of this because Bob told me. On the phone. On Sunday evenings when I called, with the uncomplicated warmth of a man describing something that was helping him through a difficult time. He said Matt was really stepping up. He said it the way parents say things about their children when those children are doing something they had hoped for. With quiet satisfaction. With relief. With relief. What was also real was the conversation Matt was having with our father, slowly, across that first spring. I do not know exactly when it started, but by May, 6 weeks after Pat died, Bob told me on the phone that he had been thinking about simplifying his finances. He used that word, simplifying. He said it the way people say words they have recently heard from someone else. Flat, without the usual small pauses he put between ideas. Simplifying how? I asked.
Just consolidating things,
he said.
Matt has been helping me look at it.
I noted it. I did not say anything.
The wound had more than one layer, and I want you to understand each one, because I did not understand them all at once. I understood them in the order they arrived. The first layer was the story Matt told our father. It went like this. Diane handles other people's estates for a living. She is very good at that. But she thinks about money the way she thinks about client files, at a distance, professionally, without feeling. She is not equipped for the personal side of things. She would not know where to begin with a family account. It is not her fault. It is just the way she is built. He did not say any of this to me directly. He said it to Bob, in the kitchen, on a Wednesday, over coffee, while I was in a conference room in Columbus reviewing a contested estate for a family whose names I will not remember in 10 years. He said it with the specific casualness of someone who has rehearsed a thing until it sounds like he is saying it for the first time. I did not know he was saying this. I would not know for another year. What I did know was that by the summer of 2019, my father had opened a secondary checking account I had no knowledge of. He had removed my name from the contact list on his primary investment account and replaced it with Matt's. And when I asked him, in August, whether he had updated his beneficiary designation since Mom died, he said Matt was handling all of that. Matt is your landscaper, I said. He is my son, Bob said. I let that go. I filed it away somewhere I knew I would need to return to. The second layer arrived at Thanksgiving of 2019. We ate at Woodmere Drive, the way we had every year of my life except 2, when Warren's family took us to Vermont. 17 people around the table in the dining room, and the card table they always pulled in from the garage. Aunt Carol brought her pierogi. Bob made the turkey. By 4 in the afternoon, someone had turned on the football game, and no one was really listening to anyone else. The house smelled the way it always smelled at Thanksgiving. The particular combination of roasting meat and Carol's dill, and the cranberry candle my mother had put on the sideboard every year since before I could remember. The candle was there this year, too. Someone had put it out for the first time without her. I did not know who, and I did not ask. Matt stood up to say grace. That was new. Bob had always said grace. But Matt stood and said it, and nobody questioned it, and Bob sat and folded his hands and looked at the table. Afterward, while I was helping Carol wrap up the leftovers, I heard Matt in the living room with 2 of Bob's college friends. They were talking about the house, what it was worth now, what Westerville property had been doing over the past few years. Matt was saying that Diane had her own thing going. She was always busy with cases,
and Dad needed someone who was actually around. One of Bob's friends said something I could not hear. Matt said, "She does not really do the personal money side. That is not her world." I heard that. I was standing in the kitchen with a roll of aluminum foil in my hand, and I heard it clearly. I noted it. I did not say anything. The third layer came in the spring of 2020. Bob had a follow-up appointment with his cardiologist in March, the kind of appointment I had always taken him to since his first stent in 2016. He called me the week before and said Matt was going to take him this time. He said it would be easier because Matt was closer to the doctor's office. He lived 22 minutes from the cardiologist's office. I lived 19. I went anyway. I called and rearranged my morning, and I showed up in the parking lot at 10:15 and rode the elevator up with them and sat in the room. Matt looked at me when I walked in, but he said nothing. Neither did I. The doctor reviewed the imaging, adjusted one medication, scheduled a follow-up in 6 months. In the elevator on the way down, the three of us stood in a row, and nobody said anything. When we got to the lobby, Matt told Bob he would bring the car around, and he walked ahead to the parking structure. Bob looked at me. "You do not have to do that, Diane," he said. "I know, Dad," I said. He looked at me for another moment, in the way he sometimes looked at me when he was deciding whether to say a second thing. Then he looked toward the door where Matt had gone. I filed that away, too. The fourth layer was the power of attorney. I was in Cleveland in June of 2020, presenting at an Ohio State Bar continuing education seminar on elder financial exploitation. That sentence will matter later. I want you to hold on to it. While I was in Cleveland, Matt drove to Woodmere Drive with a document he said an attorney friend had prepared. He told our father it was a routine power of attorney, the kind every family should have. Nothing dramatic, just making sure someone could act on Bob's behalf if he was ever incapacitated. He said Diane would have been the one to set it up, but she was in Cleveland at some conference. She was always somewhere. And this was simpler. He said it was what Pat would have wanted. Bob signed it. He was 63 years old, and he had been a widower for 15 months. And his son was sitting across from him at the kitchen table with a pen, and the afternoon light was coming through the window the way it comes through that window in June, warm and direct on the table surface, on the paper, on the place where the pen would touch. I found out 8 days later when I called the bank about an unrelated matter, and a different account manager mentioned it while reading from the file. She stopped mid-sentence when she realized what she had just said. "Can you read that again?" I said. She did. I thanked her and hung up. I sat at my desk for approximately 4 minutes. I did not call Matt. I did not call my father. I noted it. I did not say anything. The fifth layer was the money itself. 23 transfers over 22 months, from my father's primary savings account into a secondary account in Bob's name that Matt controlled under the power of attorney. The amounts were not round numbers. Not one of them. They ranged from $3,800 to $16,450. They occurred at irregular intervals, some in the same month, some 6 or 8 weeks apart. The pattern, if you could call it that, seemed designed to stay below the reporting thresholds that would have triggered an automatic flag at the bank. The total, when I finally added it up, was $284,000. That number took me a long time to say out loud, even to myself. I would say it, and then I would sit with it, and then I would say it again, the way you repeat something that your mind keeps returning because it has not yet found a place to put it. Matt used the money to keep Kowalski Outdoor Solutions solvent during 2 years when his commercial contracts dried up, and the pandemic took out 3 of his largest accounts. I know this because I am a probate attorney, and I know how to find things. The 6th layer was the night of the business dinner. It was a Wednesday in March of 2022. I had driven downtown to drop off documents at a title company on East Broad Street, and I was walking back to the parking garage when I passed Marcello's on Gay Street, the Italian place Matt used for client evenings. I had walked past it before. I was going to my car. Then I looked through the window, and I saw him. He was standing with a glass raised, 20 clients arranged around a long table, the room lit the way expensive rooms are lit when someone is paying for the atmosphere. He was comfortable in that room, the way he had always been comfortable in any room he had chosen. His sport coat looked the way it always looked, pressed in the front, slightly soft at the back of the collar. The way you look when you want to appear both serious and approachable at once. I thought about my car. I thought about the parking garage. I went inside. The hostess stopped me at the door, and I said I was meeting my brother and pointed. She let me through. I walked to the table and I found an empty chair 2 seats down from where Matt was standing, and I pulled it out and I sat down. Matt saw me before I sat. He watched me cross the room. He set his glass down and he smiled, and he looked at his clients and then at me, and he said it. "Wrong place for a funeral, lady." 4 or 5 people laughed. The man near the far end of the table repeated it quietly to the woman beside him, and she smiled. Matt's smile stayed exactly where it was. I sat down. I put on the smallest smile I owned. A server appeared, and I ordered a sparkling water with lime. Matt stood for another moment, watching me, and then he picked up his glass and continued the toast. I stayed for 40 minutes. I drank my water and I listened to the table talk about weather and spring commercial contracts and a new property development on the north side. 2 of the clients near me tried briefly to draw me into conversation, the way polite people do with someone who appears to be waiting. And I answered their questions honestly and briefly. Yes, I worked downtown. Yes, the traffic on Broad Street was difficult in the mornings. Yes, spring seemed to be arriving late this year. I was not there for the conversation. I was there because I had realized, somewhere between the title company and Marcello's, that I had spent 3 years not being in rooms. I had been in Cleveland and Cincinnati, and in my office on 5th Street, and in courtrooms and in conference rooms with other people's families. I had been doing the work I had promised other people I would do. And in the meantime, Matt had been in every room that mattered. The room where Bob sat alone after dinner. The room where the pen was handed across the kitchen table. The room where my name was quietly subtracted from a list of people who could be trusted. I finished my water. I set a 20 on the table for the server, because none of this was her problem. I said goodnight to no one in particular, and I walked out. In the parking garage, I sat in my car for a long time. I did not cry. I went over the numbers again in my head, the way I go over numbers when I need something to hold on to. 23 transfers. Not 22. Not 25. 23. $284,000. 4 years and 11 days since our mother died. 6 months. I gave myself 6 months. The address book turned up on a Saturday in April. I had been working through the boxes in my father's storage room, the ones that had been stacked against the back wall since the week after the funeral, when Matt and I had carried things over from my mother's home office. Bob had not opened any of them in 3 years. He had not asked me to either. But I had driven out to Westerville and told him I was going to start sorting, and he had said fine and gone to sit on the back porch. The storage room smelled the way stored things smell after several years. Slightly dry, slightly papery, with something underneath that was specific to this room and this house, and I did not have a name for it. It was the smell of things that had belonged to her. I noticed it, and I worked around it. The address book was in the fourth box, wrapped in a dish towel, the way my mother wrapped things she considered slightly too important to just set loose. It was small and spiral-bound, with a blue fabric cover that had faded at the corners. She had kept it since 1987. I knew this because it said so on the inside front cover, in her own handwriting. P. Address record. Started September 1987. 1987. The year Matt was born. I sat down on the floor of the storage room and I went through it. She had listed people the way she listed everything, alphabetically by last name, with phone numbers that had been updated in different colors of ink across the years as numbers changed. Some entries had notes beside them. Good neighbor, quiet. Helped with the van in '93. Sends cards at Christmas. These were not for anyone else. They were for herself. A private accounting of the people who had turned out to be worth knowing. I found the name on page 41, under S. Garrett Sims. A Columbus phone number. A title beside the name, written in the same careful print she used for addresses. Ohio Attorney General's Office, Elder Financial Protection Unit. And beside it, in parentheses, in slightly smaller handwriting than the rest, Honest, calls it what it is. The entry was dated October 2018, 5 months before she died. I sat with that. My mother had written down the name of an elder financial protection auditor 5 months before she died, and she had noted that he was honest. My mother, who spent 30 years as a school librarian and never made a note she did not need, who wrapped things she considered important in dish towels because that was the level of care she gave to the things she considered important. I turned to the back page of the address book. A post-it note was attached there, yellow, faded slightly at the edges. Her handwriting, smaller than usual, as if she had written it quickly and then decided to keep it anyway. You always knew which question to ask. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. She had not signed it. She had not needed to. I sat on the floor of that storage room for 11 minutes. I counted them. Then I put the address book in my bag, closed the box, stacked it carefully back against the wall, and walked out to the porch where my father was sitting in the aluminum folding chair he had bought the summer I turned 12. "Find anything useful?" he said. "Some things," I said. I sat with him for another 40 minutes. We talked about whether the forsythia needed trimming, and whether the Bengals had anything this season, and whether the neighbor 2 houses down had finally fixed the fence that had been falling since October. The afternoon was cool and clear, and the forsythia was indeed going to need trimming. I noted the date and told myself I would come back with the shears. Then I drove home. I had 2 options, and I had always known I had 2 options. I could do what most people in my position do, which is say something at a family dinner that accomplishes nothing and leaves everyone worse off than before. Or I could do the thing I had spent 16 years learning how to do. I drove home. I put the address book on my desk. I opened my laptop. I chose the second option. I called the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Financial Protection Unit on a Monday morning. The unit was smaller than the name suggested. 3 full-time staff and several rotating auditors, and Garrett Sims was not easy to reach on the first call. I left a message with a case intake coordinator and said I was a probate attorney in Columbus and I had a matter I wanted to discuss with a senior compliance analyst. I gave my bar number and my office number and my cell number. I said it was not an emergency. I said I would wait. He called back in 3 hours and 40 minutes. Garrett Sims had the voice of a man who had spent 2 decades reading documents and not being surprised by them. Careful, slightly flat, the kind of voice you develop when accuracy becomes more important than impression. He asked me to describe the situation without names first. I did. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he asked 3 questions, and all 3 of them were exactly the right 3 questions to ask. The same 3 questions I would have asked if I were in his position. I noted that. When I finally said the amounts involved, $284,000, 23 transfers, he said, "How long have you had the bank records?" "I do not have them yet," I said. "Get them," he said. We spoke for 22 minutes total. Before we hung up, he said he would mail me a copy of the current edition of the Ohio Elder Financial Exploitation Compliance Guide. He said it was public information, available on the Attorney General's website, but that a printed copy was easier to annotate. He said he had written most of the 3rd and 4th sections himself. The guide arrived 4 days later, in a manila envelope with the Ohio seal in the upper left corner. 112 pages. I read it the same evening it arrived, at the kitchen table, with a legal pad beside me. I annotated 47 pages. I read sections 3 and 4 3 times each. By then, the first bank statements had come. They arrived in a plain white envelope with no return address, forwarded from our office post office box. Inside were 3 folded pages, monthly statements from my father's primary savings account, covering a 6-month period in 2020 and 2021. Each transfer was highlighted in yellow marker. The highlighting was precise, not dramatic, not sloppy. The kind of highlighting you do when you have read a document more than once and you know exactly which parts matter. I knew the handwriting on the envelope immediately. My Aunt Carol, my father's younger sister, who had been slipping paper plates of leftover food into Bob's mailbox since the week after Pat died, who brought her pierogi every Thanksgiving, and her Christmas pierogi too, because she made them by hand, and she made them in quantity. And she had been doing this since before I was born. Who called me on my birthday every year without being reminded. I called her that evening. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said. "Okay," I said. There was a pause. "I have been worried for a long time," she said. "I know," I said. "Send me what you have." Over the next 11 weeks, Carol sent me 9 more envelopes. Each one contained 3 to 5 months of statements. By the end, I had coverage of the full 22-month transfer period, which accounted for all 23 transactions. The earliest was dated February of 2020, 11 months after Pat's death. The most recent was December of 2021. Carol had been collecting them for more than a year. She had obtained them the way family members sometimes do, through the quiet persistence of a woman who kept showing up, who offered to help Bob sort his mail on the Saturdays she visited, who said she liked to make sure the important things were in the right piles. Bob had not asked questions about the sorting. He trusted Carol because she was family, and because she brought pierogi, and because some people you simply trust without needing a reason. I built the folder slowly and carefully, the way I build every case. The first section was the 23 bank statements, organized chronologically, with each transfer flagged and cross-referenced. I listed the dates, the amounts, the account numbers, and the direction of each transfer in a separate typed summary. 14 pages total. I formatted it the way I format court filings, because I wanted it to be readable by someone who had never heard the story before. The second section was a copy of the power of attorney document, obtained through a proper records request to the county recorder's office. It was 4 pages. The signature on the third page was my father's. I had seen his signature thousands of times. Unhurried. The signature of a man who had not been coerced in the moment of signing. Who had been brought to that moment by a long process I was still documenting. The third section was relevant Ohio statutes, specifically Ohio Revised Code 2903.341, Elder Financial Exploitation, and Ohio Revised Code 1337.38, the agent's duties under a power of attorney, which includes the explicit requirement that the agent act in the principal's best interest and not for the agent's own benefit. I had those sections memorized, but I printed them anyway, because printed things carry weight that memorized things do not. The fourth section was Garrett Sims' guide, open to pages 61 through 74, which covered the documentation standards for establishing a pattern of elder financial abuse in a non-emergency civil context. The fifth section was the blue address book, opened to page 41. That last one was not strictly a legal document, but it was the truest thing in the folder, and I put it there anyway. There was a moment near the end of that process that I need to be honest about. It was a Thursday evening in late June, and I had been at my desk for 3 hours reviewing the draft summary when I came across something in the power of attorney records I had not examined closely enough before. It was a notarization note from the attorney who had prepared the document. The note mentioned that the grantor, my father, had been advised of the full scope of the authority he was delegating, and had confirmed his understanding and his voluntary consent. My father had not been coerced into signing that document. He had been maneuvered. He had been told a partial truth. He had been presented with a pen by his son in a moment of grief and isolation and afternoon light. All of that was real. But he had also signed willingly. Some part of him had wanted to simplify, to hand something over, to not be the one responsible for watching the numbers. Some part of him had been relieved. I sat with that for a long time. It did not change what Matt had done with the authority he had been given. It did not make the 23 transfers legal, or the money easy to recover. The shape of the story I had been telling myself, the one where my father was entirely a victim and I was entirely arriving in time to rescue him. I had not arrived in time for anything. I had been in Cleveland. I had been at work. I had been doing the thing I was good at, for other people's families, while my own father sat across the kitchen table from my brother and made a decision that made sense to him in a moment when nothing else did. I want to stop here for a moment, because this is the part of the story I had not planned to tell. The part that is harder than the numbers. I had spent 16 years in probate court, watching families discover what grief does to money, and what money does to grief. I had watched brothers stop speaking over the contents of a storage unit. I had watched sisters who had loved each other for 50 years become strangers over a house neither of them actually wanted. I had always thought I understood that from the outside, from the position of the attorney who organized the documents and kept the tone professional and helped people navigate the machinery of loss without losing more of themselves in the process. What I had not understood, until I was sitting at my own desk at 11 o'clock on a Thursday night, staring at my own father's account numbers, was that the people I had watched from the outside had not been doing something wrong. They had been doing something human. They had been trying to find somewhere to put what they could not carry. Matt had found somewhere to put it. So had I, in my way. Mine looked cleaner. It came with a manila folder and a bar license and a compliance guide. That does not mean it did not cost something. I thought about the Monday after the funeral. I thought about the 4 estate cases I had been so certain I needed to get back to. I tried, for a few minutes, to remember the names of the clients in those cases. I could remember 3 of the 4. I filed that away. I sat with it until it was part of the folder too, not as a document, but as something I carried. Then I kept working. There is a particular loneliness to building a case against someone you grew up with. I want to be accurate about that, because I think people who have not done it imagine it as simpler than it is. They imagine it as clarifying, even satisfying, the way detective stories are satisfying, where the gathering of evidence feels like a forward motion that crowds out everything else. It is not like that. Not entirely. Some evenings I would sit with the folder, and I would look at a date on one of the transfer statements, and I would remember where I had been that day. October 14th, 2020. The 3rd transfer, $9,210. I was in Dayton for a deposition. I remember the drive home on 70, the way the October light hits the fields outside of London, Ohio. Flat and golden, and slightly too beautiful for the mood I was usually in after depositions. I drove home, and I made dinner, and I called Bob, and we talked about the Indians for 12 minutes. While I was driving through that October light, my brother was moving $9,210 out of my father's savings account. While I was making dinner, the transfer was processing. While we were talking about the Indians, the money was already somewhere else. I do not tell you this because I think it changes what he did. I tell you this because I want you to understand what it is like to hold 2 true things at the same time. The thing that was happening, and the ordinary life that was happening in the same hours, in the same season, in the same city, without knowing. That is the specific cruelty of long-range deception. It does not announce itself. It does not interrupt your drive through October light. It waits. The midpoint of my case came on a Tuesday in July, when Garrett Sims called me back with a question I had not expected. He asked whether I had spoken with my father directly about any of this. I said I had not. "You might need to," he said. Not to confront, just to document his current awareness. One conversation, in your notes. What he understands about his own financial situation right now. I drove out to Westerville the following Saturday. Bob was in the backyard when I arrived, doing something with the hose and the rows of Sharon bushes along the back fence. He was moving slowly but steadily. He looked up when he heard the gate, and he raised a hand. We sat on the back porch with 2 glasses of iced tea, and I asked him about his bank accounts. I did not tell him why. I asked him to tell me, in general terms, what he thought his financial situation looked like these days. He talked for about 12 minutes. Most of what he said was vague. He mentioned that Matt had consolidated some things. He mentioned that he thought there was a savings account. He was not sure of the balance. He thought it was healthy. He had not looked at a statement in... He paused and counted. In a long time. More than a year, he thought. Matt keeps track of all that, he said. Do you know the name of the account? I asked. He said he did not. I wrote down everything he said, verbatim, in my notebook, and dated and initialed each page when I got home. That document became Section 6 of the manila folder. I knew by then that I had enough. Not to press criminal charges, which was not my goal. Not to destroy my brother publicly, which was also not my goal. My goal was the same goal it had always been. The same goal I had been working toward since I sat in the parking garage in March and gave myself 6 months. To make it stop. To make it stop in a room where the right people were watching. By August, I had been in what I would call a waiting posture for approximately 6 weeks. What I mean is this: the work was done. The folder was complete. What I was waiting for was a moment, a setting, a context in which what I had built could be seen by the people who needed to see it. Not in a letter, not in a phone call, but in a room, in person. The way accountability actually works when it works the way it should. I had not decided when or where that would be. I was waiting for Matt to decide for me. That is a thing I have learned about people who operate the way my brother operates. They create their own occasions. They move toward the next consolidation. They do not stop because stopping is not in the plan, and the plan does not have a final chapter, just a series of expansions, each one slightly larger than the last, each one depending on the previous one having worked without resistance. So I waited. The Sunday calls with my father had taken on a different quality by then. He was not evasive, exactly. He just spoke about smaller things. The card game on Thursday afternoons, the neighbor's fence, which had been fixed at last, what he had watched on television the night before. When I asked about practical matters, the house, the car, whether he had scheduled his cardiologist follow-up, he answered briefly and moved on. I noticed that he had stopped mentioning Matt by name the way he had in the months right after Pat died, when every second sentence had started with, "Matt said," or "Matt came by." That absence meant one of two things. Either things between them had become so routine they no longer needed naming, or Bob sensed, in the way that some parents sense things without being able to articulate them, that naming them to me had begun to carry a different weight. I did not know which. I noted it, and I let him talk about the card game. The first move came in late July. I registered myself as a secondary authorized contact on my father's primary bank account. This is a completely routine step for a family member with a law license and a legitimate interest in an elderly parent's financial well-being. The bank had a standard form. I submitted the form with my bar number and a letter of explanation. I was now on file as someone who could receive information about the account in the event of a dispute or a health crisis. Matt did not find out about this for several weeks. When he did, he called me. "What are you doing?" he said. "I am protecting Dad's interests," I said. "Same as you." There was a pause. I waited through it. "Diane," he said. "Yes?" I said. "We should talk. In person," he said. "We are talking," I said. He said we should meet for coffee. I said I was very busy this month. I said we could talk by phone any time, and he had my number. Then I said goodnight and hung up. He did not call back. The second move came in August. Carol called me on a Sunday evening to tell me that Matt had approached Bob about co-signing as a guarantor on a $50,000 business loan for Kowalski Outdoor Solutions. The lender had required a second signature, and Matt had told Bob it was a formality, that the business was performing well, that this was simply how commercial lending worked for growing companies. He had the paperwork prepared and had scheduled the signing for the following weekend, at Woodmere Drive, over lunch. I called my father on Monday morning. I did not tell him not to sign. I told him I had some professional concerns about co-signing arrangements in general, and asked if he would mind if I looked at the loan documents first, as a professional courtesy, just to make sure everything was in standard form. He said that sounded fine. He sounded relieved, actually. I noted that. I called the lender, identified myself as the family's attorney of record for estate matters, and requested copies of the loan documents for client review. The lender sent the documents within 2 business days. I reviewed them that evening. Wet them that evening. The terms were not unusual, but the collateral section included language that would allow the lender to make a claim against Bob's personal assets in the event of default. Those assets, as I now knew, had been significantly depleted. I sent my father a 1-page letter, written in plain language, explaining what co-signing a loan means and what his personal financial exposure would be if the business did not perform as expected. I included 2 questions I suggested he ask any attorney he chose before signing anything. He did not co-sign. He told Matt he needed more time to think about it. Matt called me 3 days later. His voice had a quality in it I had not heard before. Not anger exactly, but close to it. Close to the edge of something he was working to keep controlled. "You sent Dad a letter about the loan," he said. "I sent him information," I said. "He is not your client, Diane." "No," I said. "He is my father." The line was very quiet. I counted to 5 in my head. "I do not know what you think you are doing," Matt said. "I think I am doing what Mom would have wanted," I said. He hung up. I filed that away. The distance between us had shifted, and we both knew it, and neither of us named it yet. Warren asked me that week how things were going with my father's situation. He knew some of it, not all. I had told him enough to explain why I had been at my desk late on several consecutive evenings, why the thick manila folder had moved from the kitchen table to my desk, to the car, and back. Why I sometimes went quiet in conversations that had nothing to do with any of it. He was the kind of husband who noticed these things without demanding to be briefed on them immediately. He gave me space, and he gave me presence at the same time, which is a harder thing to do than it sounds, and which I had not always appreciated the way I should have. I told him the folder was complete. I told him I was waiting. "What happens when you find the moment?" he said. I thought about it for a while. "I read the numbers out loud," I said, "in a room, and then it is someone else's problem to figure out what to do with them." "And then?" he said. "I don't know," I said. "I think that's where I find out what kind of person I became while I was building the folder." He nodded. He did not say anything else about it that evening. That was one of the things I had always been grateful for about Warren. He knew when a question was enough. The 3rd move came in early September, a Sunday dinner at Woodmere Drive with about 8 family members, the kind of casual gathering that happened 3 or 4 times a year. Matt brought a man he introduced as Gary, a financial consultant he said had been helping the family get organized. Gary was friendly and vague, in the careful way of men whose professional purpose is to make complicated things feel simple before you have fully understood them. He had a yellow legal pad, and he talked about streamlining and efficiency and what he called a coordinated family asset strategy. He used the word cohesive 3 times. He said it was really about giving Bob peace of mind. I sat at the table and I listened. I asked Gary 2 questions. First, what his licensing credentials were in Ohio. Second, whether he had a written fiduciary agreement with any of the family members he was representing. He answered the first question with something general about financial planning certifications, and did not directly answer the second. I wrote down both answers, verbatim, in my phone. Not because I needed them immediately, because I needed to know exactly what kind of man Gary was. And I had found out. The rest of that dinner, I watched Matt work the room. That is the only way I know how to describe it. Between conversations the way he had always moved through rooms, easily, without appearing to be working at anything. He checked on Bob twice. He brought a second glass of wine to Bob's college friend without being asked. He laughed at the right moments, and was serious at the right moments. And by the time the evening ended, I think most of the people at that table believed that Matt Kowalski was a man who loved his father and was doing his level best by him. That was the most difficult thing to hold, alongside everything else I knew. Not because it was false, exactly. Because it was not entirely false. Matt did love our father, in the particular way of people who love someone and still use them, who keep the feeling genuine while the actions go somewhere the feeling would never sanction if it had been asked directly. I drove home that night, and I sat in the driveway for 7 minutes before going inside. I did not go over the numbers. I just sat there. After dinner, Carol caught my eye from across the kitchen. I met her by the back door, and she spoke quietly. "He is trying to move faster," she said. "I know," I said. "There is a birthday party," she said. "Bob's 70th. Matt is planning it." Barley's Restaurant, 3rd week of September, Saturday evening. He told me he wanted to use the occasion to get some estate documents finalized while the whole family was together. She paused. He said it would be easier while everyone is in a good mood. I looked at her for a moment. "Will you be there?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "I need you to bring someone," I said. "As your guest. I will send you the name and number." She looked at me carefully. Then she nodded once, the way she had nodded at things her whole life. The way that meant she understood, and she was in, and there would be no further discussion needed. I drove home, and I called Garrett Sims. The fourth move was the simplest one, and I want to be precise about what it was. It was not a move I made. It was a move Matt made, and I let him make it. He had scheduled the signing for the birthday dinner. He had the document already prepared. He had 43 witnesses booked into a restaurant on a Saturday evening. He had built the occasion himself, with the flowers and the food and the toast he would give before he slid the paper across the table. He had done everything I would have done if I were the one who needed the room to be warm before the ask. That was the fourth move. He walked into the room I had been waiting for him to build. The only thing I added was Garrett Sims in the corner table with Carol. I want to pause before I tell you about the evening at Barley's, because this is the part of the story where I most need to be honest with myself. In the 2 weeks between Carol's news and the birthday dinner, I sat with the manila folder many nights at my desk. Not reviewing it. I knew every page. I had known every page for months. I sat with it because I needed to understand what I was about to do, and what my reasons actually were, as opposed to what I wanted my reasons to be. I told myself, and I believe this was true, that I was doing this for my father. That 70 years old was not too late to protect someone. That had started would not stop on its own, because that is the nature of these things once they have started. That if I had evidence of elder financial exploitation and I did not act on it, I would be culpable in a way that my profession and my conscience both refused. All of that was true. What was also true was that I had been waiting, in some form, since the night I walked into Marcello's and sat down and ordered a sparkling water with lime, for the room that would go quiet. I had been waiting for the moment when the easy certainty my brother carried through every room he entered would meet something it could not move through.
I am not proud of that. I am not ashamed of it either. I am simply being accurate. The folders I build are accurate, and so is this. That Saturday evening in September, before I drove to Barley's, I sat at my desk and went through the folder one final time. I looked at Pat's address book, open to page 41. Garrett Sims, honest, calls it what it is. I looked at it for a long time. Then I closed the folder. I put on my coat. I drove. I arrived at Barley's at 6:47, 3 minutes before the time I had planned. The restaurant was full, in the way that family gatherings fill a restaurant, warmly and somewhat chaotically. People finding seats and hugging each other and calling across the room. The lighting was the amber kind that makes everyone look slightly better than they do in offices. The kind of room where nothing bad ever seems possible, which is exactly the kind of room where the unexpected lands hardest. I counted the guests as I walked in. 43 people. I noted it. The tables had been arranged in a long configuration along one wall, with smaller tables near the window. And someone had ordered flowers, a simple centerpiece on each one. The kind of gesture that communicates care without demanding to be noticed. The air smelled of garlic and bread, and a room full of people who were glad to be somewhere together on a Saturday night in September. I noticed all of this, the way I notice everything in rooms where something is about to happen. Not because I was looking for it, because noticing is a habit that runs too deep to turn off. Bob was at the head of the main table. He was wearing the green sweater I had given him 2 Christmases ago, and his face was the way it gets at family gatherings, open and a little overwhelmed in equal measure. He saw me come in and he waved, and I went to him, and I put my hand on his shoulder, and I said, "Happy birthday, Dad." And he said, "Thank you, Diane." And that was all we said right then. Matt saw me too. He was near the bar, talking to someone I did not recognize. He watched me cross the room to Bob, and his expression made the small adjustment it always made. The slight recalibration that looked like nothing, but meant everything. He smiled. He looked back at his conversation. I found my seat at the main table. I put my coat over the back of the chair. I placed the manila folder in my lap under the table. Garrett Sims was at a corner table near the window, with Carol and 2 other guests. He was wearing his reading glasses around his neck on a beaded chain, and he had a glass of water in front of him, and he was looking at the menu with the careful attention of a man who reads everything before deciding. He did not look up when I came in. I did not look at him. That was how we had agreed to do it. The dinner was the way family dinners are at the beginning, before anything happens. People talked about the drive-in, about the weather, about Bob's health and what the doctor had said at his last appointment. Someone asked Bob how it felt to be 70, and he said it felt like 69 had, mostly, which got a good laugh. The food came, and it was good, and the wine was passed, and for a while it was simply a family in a room on a Saturday night, which is a good thing to be. I watched Bob during that dinner. He was better than I had seen him in a long time. Or perhaps more accurately, he was different. He had the quality of a man who has made peace with something. Not happily, not fully, but practically. He told a story about a fishing trip from 1981, a story I had heard before,
And he told it with the small variations that stories acquire across decades, slightly different each time, which is how you can tell a story is actually true. I thought about all the birthdays before this one. The ones when Pat would make the pierogi cake he inexplicably loved, and the candles she put on the sideboard, and who had been at those tables, and how many of them were still at this one. I thought about her address book, in my bag under my chair. I thought about the kind of faith that goes into writing someone's name down in a small blue book, and trusting that the right person will find it. I thought about the kind of attention that requires, the kind that pays itself fully and quietly, and that most people do not recognize until it is already gone. Then Matt stood up. He thanked everyone for coming, said that turning 70 was a milestone, and that Dad deserved a night like this, surrounded by the people who had been part of his life. He talked about their father's hands, the hands of a craftsman, the hands of a man who built things, and how much the family had learned from watching those hands work. Several people at the table nodded. It was a good speech. I want to be accurate about that. He was good at this. Then he said he wanted to share some good news about the family going forward. He said he and Bob had been working together for a few years now on getting things properly organized, making sure the right structures were in place, making sure that everything Bob had worked for would be protected. He said it was really just a formality at this point, some final documents he and Dad had discussed, and that he wanted to use tonight, with the whole family together, to get the signatures completed. He said there was no better moment than a birthday, surrounded by the people you love. He reached into the jacket he had brought to his chair, and he slid a document across the table to Bob. Bob looked down at it. I opened the manila folder. I did not shout. I simply began to speak, clearly, at a pace that carried across the table without effort. Dad, I said, before you sign that, I want to share some information with you. I am going to read some figures, and I am asking everyone at this table to listen, because you are all witnesses to this family, and you deserve to know what has been happening. The table went quiet the way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens, completely and immediately. Matt's head turned toward me. Between February of 2020 and December of 2021, I said, 23 transfers were made from your primary savings account. I have the statements here, all 23, with the dates and the amounts. The first transfer was on February the 4th, 2020, $3,800. The second was on March the 16th, $6,220. I continued reading. I read all 23. I did not rush, and I did not slow down. I read each one the way I read any legal record, clearly, with the date, the amount, and the destination account number. The table was completely still. When I finished, I said, the total is $284,000. That is your money, Dad. It came from your savings account, under a power of attorney signed in June of 2020. The power of attorney authorizes Matthew Kowalski to act on your behalf. Bob was looking at the table, not at me, not at Matt, just at the white tablecloth in front of him. Matt said my name. He said it the way you say a word when you are trying to reclaim a room you have already lost. I said, there is also a person here tonight I would like to introduce. His name is Garrett Sims. He is a senior compliance analyst with the Ohio Attorney General's Elder Financial Protection Unit. He is here as Carol's guest this evening. He has been familiar with this situation for several months. Garrett Sims stood up from the corner table. He removed his reading glasses from around his neck and folded them into his jacket pocket. He introduced himself carefully, with full credentials and no unnecessary words. He said he had reviewed the documentation that had been assembled, and that it was thorough and consistent with the evidentiary standards his office required for an elder financial exploitation inquiry. He said he was not there in an official enforcement capacity that evening, but that his office would be in contact with the family in the coming weeks. Then he sat down. For a long moment, the room was completely silent. 43 people, and a restaurant full of dinnerware, and the sound of the kitchen somewhere behind a closed door, and nobody at the table saying anything at all. Matt set down the document he had planned for Bob to sign. He set it down carefully, with the same even, controlled motion he used for everything. But his face had done something I had not expected. Not anger, not outrage, not the things I had imagined it might do in the months I had been building toward this evening. His face had gone to a place I recognized from 22 years of working with families in courtrooms and conference rooms and probate offices. It was the face of a person who had been very certain about something for a very long time, and who had just walked into the room where the certainty ran out. He looked at me. I looked at him. Bob said, quietly, to the table in general, "I did not know about the money." Nobody answered him. I closed the manila folder. For a while, the room was a room where nobody moved. Then, gradually, it became a room again. Someone near the far end said something quietly to the person beside them. A server appeared in the kitchen doorway, took in the silence, and retreated. A woman 2 seats from Bob put her hand over his hand on the tablecloth, and he let her. Matt sat down. He did not look at anyone. He picked up his water glass and he set it back down without drinking from it. He looked, for the first time in my adult memory of him, like a man who was smaller than the room he was sitting in. Carol caught my eye from across the table and gave me one small nod. Bob spoke once more, near the end, while people were quietly finding their coats. He looked at the flowers on the table and he said, "Your mother knew, didn't she?" It was not quite a question. "I think so," I said. "Sounds right," he said. I drove him to Westerville that night. We did not talk in the car. When I pulled up to Woodmere Drive, he sat for a moment before opening the door, the way he sometimes sat deciding whether to say the second thing. Then he got out, walked to the front door, and let himself in. I sat in the driveway until the light came on inside. Then I drove home. The weeks after that evening moved the way weeks always move after something changes that you cannot unchange. Slowly at first, then all at once, then slowly again. The power of attorney was revoked within 10 days. Matt signed the revocation without being asked twice. I think by then he understood that the path forward was narrow, and that cooperation was the only way through it that preserved anything at all. The Ohio Attorney General's office opened a formal inquiry the following month. I will not describe the details of that process here, because some of it is ongoing, and some of it belongs to people other than me. What I will say is that the process was slow and painstaking, and far less dramatic than the evening at Barley's had been. Most things are. Matt retained his own attorney. The conversations between our family's legal representatives over the following months were careful and formal, and nothing like the way 2 siblings talk. There were agreements about repayment timelines and asset disclosures and conditions of cooperation. The company, Kowalski Outdoor Solutions, entered a restructuring process. Some of the $284,000 would be recoverable over time. Some of it would not. I am not sure when Matt and I stopped being people who talked directly to each other. I think it was somewhere in the parking garage in March, the night I sat in my car for a long time before driving home. But it is also possible it was earlier than that, at a Thanksgiving table, or in a hospital room, or on a Wednesday at Woodmere Drive when he was there and I was not. I do not know the exact date. I noted that, too. My father moved into an independent living community in Gahanna in November. It was his choice. He had toured it twice before the events at Barley's, which surprised me when Carol told me, because it meant he had been thinking about it already, on his own, without telling anyone. He said he was tired of the house. He said Pat had been the one who loved the house, who knew every corner of it, who had ideas for the garden every spring. And without her, it was just a lot of square footage that needed maintaining by someone who no longer had the energy. He seemed lighter when I visited him there, in a way I had not expected, and did not know how to name. He had a card game on Tuesday afternoons with 3 other men his age, and he had found a table he liked in the dining hall, by the window where the light was good in the morning. He was learning to like the pie. He said it was better than he had expected. I visited him on Sundays. We talked about the card game and the Bengals, and whether the staff would let him put a small bird feeder outside his window. He did not talk about Matt. Neither did I. We were finding the shape of what we were to each other now that the house was gone and the arrangement had changed. And it was slow work. The kind of work you do one Sunday at a time. There was a Sunday in October when he asked me something I was not prepared for. We were sitting by the window watching the bird feeder, which the staff had agreed to after he asked 3 times in his polite and persistent way. And he said, without looking away from the window, "Why didn't you just call me?" when he first figured it out. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. Not because I did not know the answer, because I wanted to give him the real one. "I was not sure yet what I had," I said, "and I did not want to put it on you until I was sure." He considered that. A chickadee landed on the feeder and left. "Your mother would have called," he said. "I know," I said. "She would have called, and then she would have also done everything you did. She just would have called first." I sat with that for a moment. "She left me a note," I said. He turned and looked at me. I told him about the post-it on the back page of the address book. I read it to him from memory. He listened with the complete stillness he had had in the hospital room 3 years earlier, in the vinyl chair beside her bed. When I finished, he turned back to the window. "Sounds right," he said. We sat there a while longer, watching the birds come and go, and he told me the name of each one. In December, I drove to the cemetery on a Tuesday afternoon. Not a significant date. Not an anniversary of anything. I just drove there. Pat's headstone was simple, the way she would have wanted it. Her name, her years. 1 line. She kept a list of everything. That was Warren's line, and it was the right one. I stood there for a while without saying anything. The wind came off the open part of the cemetery in a way that was cold but not unpleasant, and the bare trees along the road made a sound that was almost nothing, almost just air. I took the blue address book out of my coat pocket and held it. I had been carrying it since April. It had been in my bag, then in my desk, then in my bag again, the way you carry something you are not quite ready to put down. I looked at her handwriting on page 41. Garrett Sims. Honest. Calls it what it is. October 2018. She had written it 5 months before she died. I had wondered, in the months since I found it, whether she had suspected something specific, or whether she was simply doing what she always did, keeping lists, gathering names, making sure the right information was in the right place for the people who would need it. I think she knew. I think she knew in the way that some people know things. Not with certainty, not with proof, but with the particular attention that comes from watching someone you love for 30 years and noticing when his face does something it has not done before. I think she wrote that name down and wrapped the book in a dish towel and trusted that someone would find it when it was needed. She always knew which question to ask. I put the address book back in my coat pocket. I found it, I said out loud, to the headstone, to the December afternoon. Then I got in my car and drove home. I want to tell you what I kept from all of this, and what I lost. I kept the clarity. I have always been good at clarity. I know now that 23 transfers totaling $284,000 happened, and that they were wrong, and that I found them, and that the finding of them changed something that could not otherwise have been changed. That is factual, and I hold on to it on the days when nothing else feels solid. What I lost is harder to name. I had been carrying since we were children, in the same house on Woodmere Drive. The one where he was not quite right, but not quite this either. The version where you could still be wrong about him in a hopeful direction. I do not grieve it the way I thought I would. I notice its absence the way you notice a sound that has stopped. For a while you keep listening for it. Then you stop. I also lost something I did not expect, and it took me longer to see it. I lost the certainty that I had been only the victim in this story. I was the one who documented everything, the one who built the folder, made the phone calls, read 23 transfers aloud in a room of 43 people who went quiet. I was right about the facts, and I remain right about the facts. But I was also the person who was not in the room for 3 years. The person who went back to work on a Monday. The person who called from hotel rooms in Cleveland and Cincinnati and trusted that someone else would handle the Wednesdays and the Saturdays, the furnace filters, the cardiologist appointments, the kitchen table conversations that shaped what my father believed about who he could rely on. I am not saying that makes what Matt did acceptable. I am saying that if you spend enough time with your own manila folder, you eventually find the page with your own name on it. The lesson I took from 16 years of probate law and 1 year of sitting on a storage room floor is not that you should be suspicious of the people who are present. The lesson is that presence itself is a form of power, and that the people who love you will sometimes be shaped by who shows up and who does not, in ways that are genuinely hard to recover from later. That is not a comfortable lesson. It is the true one. I have new clients this year who remind me, slightly, of my father. Older men and women sitting across the conference table from me at Hartwell and Reed, looking at documents they did not prepare, trying to understand the difference between what they were told and what is actually there. I sit with them the way I have always sat with clients, carefully, at the right pace, not hurrying the understanding. But something is different in me now when I sit across from these particular clients. I do not know how to name it exactly. It is not pity, which has always been the wrong emotion for this work. It is something closer to recognition. I recognize what it costs to hand something over to someone you trust. I recognize what the room looks like
after you find out the handing over went somewhere you did not know about. I take more time with these clients now. I ask one more question than I used to ask. I let there be a pause before we move to the next page, because some things need a pause before they can be understood correctly. I do not tell them about my father. That is not my job, and it is not their business. But Pat's address book is on my desk. And sometimes, when a session ends and I am sitting alone in the conference room, gathering the documents into the right piles, I look at it through the open door of my office, and I think about the kind of attention that goes into writing someone's name down in a small blue book and noting beside it, honest, calls it what it is. That is what I want to be. Not for my clients only, though for them too. For myself. For the person I am still figuring out how to become, now that the folder is closed and the room has gone quiet, and the rest of this is just the work of living. My father is doing better. He has a bird feeder outside his window now. A small wooden one I helped him hang in October. On Sunday afternoons when I visit, we sit by the window and watch the birds come and go, and he tells me their names, with the patient authority of a man who has been learning them carefully since November and intends to know them all by spring. The blue address book is on my desk at the office now, between the stapler and the phone. I have not put it away. I do not know if I will. There is a question I have been sitting with since the evening at Barley's. Since the moment I closed the manila folder and the room went quiet, and my father looked at the white tablecloth and said those 7 words. I do not know what you would have done. I do not know whether you have your own folder somewhere, your own set of numbers that add up to something you were not supposed to find. Your own version of a Tuesday in March when someone handed you information you could not put back. But if you do, here is the only thing I know how to say. The expertise that someone dismisses you for is the one thing they can never take from you. The question your mother trusted you to ask is still yours to ask, even after she is gone. And when the room finally goes quiet, you do not need to say anything more than the numbers. The numbers are enough. They always were. What would you have done